And so now I would like to introduce our facilitators for today, Dr. Katey Shirey and Dr. Karin Jensen. Dr. Katey Shirey works STEM from her combined interest in science, art, and education. Dr. Shirey graduated from the University of Virginia with a bachelor's degree in physics and sculpture. She received her master's in secondary science education, also from Virginia, and taught physics at Washington Liberty High School in Arlington, Virginia. Dr. Shirey received her PhD in 2017 from the University of Maryland in curriculum and instruction, with a focus on teacher challenges and productive resources for integrating engineering design into high school physics. Dr. Karin Jensen is a teaching assistant professor in bioengineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her research interests include student mental health and wellness, engineering student career pathways, and engagement of engineering faculty in engineering education research. She was awarded a career award from the National Science Foundation for her research on undergraduate mental health and engineering programs. Before joining UIUC, she completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Sanofi Oncology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She earned a bachelor's degree in biological engineering from Cornell University and a PhD in biomedical engineering from the University of Virginia. First, I would like to thank you all for coming and to sharing your experiences and insight about the awards information for these two awards. And so I'll stop sharing my screen, and Dr. Shirey, you can share yours.
I think we're going to take advantage of this time together. We're going to be able to hear about the two Commission on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Awards. And we're going to be able to speak with two of the authors of the 2020 Best Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Award paper. And it's really exciting to have them here because papers for ASEE, our drafts are due coming up in 1 month. So it's great that we have the opportunity to hear from authors as you all are writing at home. And we know that this recording will be shared with the whole ASW community. So we're really looking to this session to help us all learn about what writing those papers can be like. So really briefly here, the session today, we're going to have just, little bit of intros we've done already, a little bit of background on CDEI, that's the Commission on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the awards themselves. And then we're going to have a long conversation with the authors. We've come up with some questions that we think will be stimulating. And I'm also going to tell you a little overview about the paper, although our emphasis is really on their process and what authors can take away from their experiences. And then if we have time later, we'd love to welcome some questions. And we are all going to be sharing resources with you as well as our email addresses so that if you have further questions, you can follow up with us individually. So the ASEE Commission, it's actually on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. It evolved out of the Year of Diversity. That was the 2014 to 2015 year for ASEE. It started off as a diversity task force, and then the commission has grown from there to include all membership from across all of the divisions, sections, zones, really all the units within ASEE. Our goals are to increase the visibility, improve the baseline knowledge, empower members, and leverage events within ASEE and ASEE affiliates to increase diversity in engineering. We want to increase that visibility and the perceived importance of diversity within all engineering and related communities. So the commission does this via several functions. We've got a really active Twitter group. We have a nice website and a blog, and I'll give you those URLs in one moment. But we also do it through these two awards. And so an awards committee comes together each year, and this year Karin and I are on that awards committee, but it's also, we have about 8 other members as well. We sponsor and manage the ASEE Best Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Paper Award, and that's been awarded since the Year of Action on Diversity 2015. And we have a new award this year, which is called the ASEE Constituent Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Award. Just very briefly, the paper award involves soliciting nominations of draft and final papers from across all divisions and zones and sections. So Zone and section conferences happen all year, and those papers are eligible as well as ones that are submitted and presented at the annual conference. Those are due April 26th this year. From those papers, 5 to 7 finalists are selected by the ASEE Commission's Awards Committee. We actually bring in a selection committee. So the awards committee brings in a selection committee. We get 5 to 7 finalists, and all of those finalists present at a special session at the annual conference. So that's really cool. And then from that presentation, as well as the paper itself, the final big winner among winners is selected, and they also present the following year at the annual conference. We do have several supports for our constituents, and I'm just going to set these in the chat for anyone that's here, and also they'll be available for you later on. So we have the paper website, which details sort of what I've just said here. It also links you to the paper rubric. That rubric is used by that selection committee to evaluate papers. And we have a handy one-page guide that was introduced in order to summarize what makes a really great diversity, equity, and inclusion paper. That one-page guide sort of differentiates a great diversity, equity, inclusion paper from a good one. And the difference being that a good paper will kind of go beyond, a great paper will go beyond the good paper in recognizing and targeting the importance of centering really the mission towards increasing diversity in engineering. And then lastly, there's a link for the call for nominations. The call for nominations gives you the discrete link for this year's submissions. Okay, and then just to touch on it, the Constituent Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Award is, the nominations are due in 1 week, so that's January 15. The constituent is any unit. It's a group of people, actually. So a constituent sometimes sounds like one individual, but this is not nominating one individual. This is nominating the efforts of some unit, some division or section, or a group of authors, or a task force, or even people at your university, maybe your whole department. It's a constituent member of ASEE that's doing work towards increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion in engineering and engineering education. So if you've got a great partnership that you know about that's really doing good work in the community to increase inclusivity, we want to hear about it and potentially award you with this constituent award. So I think just to clarify, it's not one person, it is a group. And again, I mentioned we have a great blog and a Twitter feed, the @ASEE Diversity Twitter feed. Feel free to interact with that, to jump in there and ask questions. We want to be here to help you, even if it's not about these awards, anything that you're thinking around diversity and engineering, that's the community for you. And there's also the ASEE Hub. And my note to myself says, we're working on it. So we're working on it. Okay, so it's my really sincere pleasure now to introduce our special guests. Samara Boyle, a research assistant. She's an undergraduate studying neuroscience at Rice University in Houston, Texas. She works as a research assistant for Dr. Yvette Pearson in the George R. Brown School of Engineering. Her primary research focus is the advancement of diversity, equity, and inclusion in engineering education. We also welcome Dr. Canek Phillips, who's a research scientist in the George R. Brown School of Engineering at Rice University, where his research interests touch broadly on efforts to promote greater equity for underrepresented groups in engineering. Canek earned his PhD from Purdue School of Engineering Education in 2016 and worked as a graduate research assistant in Dr. Alice Pauley's Feminist Research and Engineering Education Lab. Canek was brought on at Rice originally as a postdoctoral research fellow in 2017.
It's a fail because we'll just have to re-execute this one section.
I'm hearing a little background. Is that possible to mute? Thank you. Was brought on as a postdoctoral research fellow in 2017 on an NSF-funded study that investigates the efficacy of an audio-based method of learning mathematics, where he now serves as co-PI. In 2019, he began working as a co-PI on another NSF-funded study to reduce barriers in the hiring of underrepresented racial minority faculty in data science and data engineering fields. And these two authors are co-authors on the paper that won the 2020 ASEE Best CDEI Paper Award. And the paper that they won with is titled An Exploratory Study of Intentionality Towards Diversity in STEM Faculty Hiring, excuse me. And the other authors on the paper include
all these people.
all these wonderful people, yeah.
They're the co-PIs and PIs on the project.
I'm just going to list them off here. We've got Dr. Yvette Pearson, Dr. Reginald DeRoche, Professor Stephen Mattingly, Dr. Ann Nordberg, Professor Wei Wayne Lee, and Professor Hanadai Rifai, excuse me. And I'd like to summarize your paper. I've cleared this with them ahead of time, so I'm going to give a summary of your paper, but then of course we'd love to have you clarify for me should I miss anything significant. The authors investigated the ways that inclusivity and exclusivity messages were embedded in public job postings for data science, data engineering, data analysis, or data analytics faculty positions during September of 2019. They found that intentional language towards diversity varied widely among the postings. Most postings had non-targeted language that did not include a word or phrase targeting underrepresented minority candidates, revealing a major opportunity for improvement. Of the targeted language that was present, including passages that included a term or phrase specifically targeting underrepresented minority candidates, the postings reflected a desire for diversity, and in particular, a commitment to racial or ethnic diversity. The authors used their analysis to identify and even rewrite possible language that could target underrepresented minorities' specific skills related to targeted candidate descriptions, such as calling for faculty to have a specific skills and research methods, such as critical race theory, intersectionality, or indigenous methods, instead of only targeting a history of service in the equity area. All right. Now they told me not to talk at the audience, and I've succeeded in talking at you the whole time. But I really recommend clicking on this link I've just put in the chat. That is the link to their paper. It's a terrific paper. It is the best paper after all. I encourage you to read it, and we'll post the link again in the future. Authors, is there anything regarding the content of the paper that you'd like to share with us before we get into some questions about your process?
Any thoughts, Canek?
Yeah, well, so the paper, the crux of it is about this idea of intentionality. And so looking at these proposals, at the time it was only 21, now we've looked at over 80 because we're trying to write a paper about it. Race is in these articles or in these postings. And I guess kind of the job we did was like to really kind of identify how, like, the flavor of how it's talked about. And what we use is this idea of intentionality, which is like if you were underrepresented or racialized and ethnic, a racially or ethnically minoritized applicant to these positions, like how would you feel like, do you think they're really talking to you? And so I really came from my own perspective of like going out for faculty jobs. And that's where like a lot of the inspiration came from, of like kind of seeing the back end of like what this kind of unintentional language really means when you're going out on these faculty searches. And, you know, and I guess the other thing is that like Samara just, you know, she's only an undergrad, but it was, you know, amazing working with her on that. And she like a lot of like, you know, a lot of the things that it took me years to really understand about race, like, you know, she really grasped really fast. So really, you know, is there anything you'd like to say?
I'm sorry if you're hearing a leaf blower in the background. Perfect timing. I really enjoyed working with Dr. Phillips. I said earlier, I think we have complementary writing styles and our brains work differently, but I think it all came together really well. And we brought a lot of different perspectives. We have a lot of different perspectives present in our larger project, but then also on this paper. I guess the only other thing I would add for those watching later is maybe some context regarding the phrase targeted language. Canek and I got that from a paper by Avery and McKay on the practice of targeted recruitment in businesses. And the idea is that professionals seeking to increase diversity will include those target phrases that are specifically meant to reach members of particular audiences.
Great, yeah. So we've come up with a list of questions that we could go through, but I'm going to jump around through them because this paper was about race and hiring practices, and the targeted language that you're speaking about is sort of like, it's been codified in some ways, right? There was a part of your paper where you explicitly noted that some of that targeted language is actually a legally required equal hiring practices language. That's, you know, it's required to be there. And sometimes that was the only thing on the whole listing that like seemed to even mention the fact that institution would be hiring for a diverse faculty. So I just think it's kind of noteworthy that that was the case. And in some ways, did you feel like that really undoes the whole emphasis of what it's supposed to be, right? It's become codified, it's become this automatic requirement. Do you think that in some ways that just becomes like the skip reading text, like it's not even acknowledging a sincere effort anymore?
Canek, I don't know if you remember the way Dr. Phillips put this way several months ago.
Well, yeah. So I mean, okay. So like, kind of now knowing what we now know about like after reading a ton of these, is that a lot of the language about diversity and even the word like in these things are actually like they're the equal employment statements that are, I think, what you're talking about, the codified things. So so many times you'll have an equal employment statement that's like required, but then like they'll also take the equal employment statement and just add some words to like space it out some more. And so like what you were saying, like it really just takes any, like if you've read a lot of these before, then you kind of understand how they're like, how they view race, like how employers are you know, from a, you know, some people within the department might see it differently, but these are artifacts of like I don't mean to get too disjointed, but like there was this thing called the civil rights movement that happened, and this is a reflection of the success of that. But then like for the last like 50 years, it's been eaten away at and compromised. And so you kind of see that in terms of like, this is what an institution feels like is like acceptable. And additionally, there's this thing about it too, that's like because it's just it's these codified words, it's easy to subvert what they mean, especially in terms of this idea of equal opportunity. So with the civil rights movement, it was successful in implementing affirmative action, and affirmative action really just means like, you know, because of these historical discriminatory practices in the past, we have to account for those things by saying that there needs to be some sort of equity in place that leads to advanced hiring of people. It doesn't mean giving people an extra leg up in hiring practices, but that's often like what people understand it as, especially non-URM groups. And so just, I guess to close this off, it's like you kind of just feel kind of just like what where we're at with, in terms of like the people that put these things out are the HR departments of institutions. And it just kind of shows you kind of disconnect between like what people are actually working in like their own departments and like how they feel about diversity, and if they're even able to communicate that to the people that write these things up. So I'm sorry for that being so long.
Great. It's great. It's a great discussion. And I think it really like kind of cuts the chase of some of this, which is that the things that our researchers want to talk about, the diversity that they want to see in their departments, is sometimes very hard to communicate with the outside world as it transfers through the funnels of the hierarchies within their institution to the HR department that finally gets it out there. So it leads to a good question about language and about intentionality in language. And researchers also have to do this, right? Where we're authoring papers, and that's going to be put out as a representation of us and a representation of our universities and our whole agendas, and sometimes our funders and all these things. So you guys in the paper used the URM term, the underrepresented minorities. And I just wanted to call that up and then discuss those decisions that you made around it. Especially in light of like how Canek earlier, you kind of used a different phraseology, racially and ethnically minoritized minorities, right? So like, I think that's what it is, a minoritized population, perhaps I wrote it down.
Groups, yeah, minoritized groups or populations.
Thank you, sorry, I misquoted you. So the question I had was like, I believe that some authors that might listen to this may wonder how they can speak about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in productive and honest ways without offending their audience, their peers, their supervisors, their funders, etc. Especially if they lack the sort of technical training in the area, but they want to talk about it, right? So we are encouraging all ASEE division authors to talk about it. So how can, one mechanic like word choice assist them in talking productively and honestly? And I'm wondering what went into your thinking around that and the kinds of language that you chose to use. Like in your paper, you use the word race neutral, but you put it in quotation marks at some point. And I'm wondering if that was because you don't believe there's such a thing as a race neutral decision, right? So like, I just am curious about that. And if you could offer, please, any advice to other authors about navigating the mechanics of writing about diversity, potentially for the first time, because we want them to. So any suggestions?
Particularly our use of the URM phrase came from our guiding documents, because that was the language used by the NSF and in our grant documents. And so we chose to use that phrase for consistency. I also feel like, I know Dr. Pearson and I discussed this, while our team adopts phrases more like historically marginalized groups or racially minoritized groups in everyday conversation, phrases like URM, I think, are also used more commonly. And that kind of helped with Canek. Maybe you can jump into visibility of the paper and I don't know, commonality of understanding, I guess.
Yeah, so language evolves, and so I'm still trying to like make it more of a reflex when I say racially and ethnically minoritized. I remember when Latinx, like that was something I had to absorb in my lexicon, and it's kind of like you only kind of get it into your lexicon if like you're constantly engaging with it with everyone, so you kind of like as a community learn about like, oh, this person created this like seminal work and this is like the word that is being used now. I remember, yeah, like Dr. James Hawley at Wayne State, we were writing up a grant and I used URM and he's like, I'd prefer racially and ethnically minoritized. And I was like, okay, that's new to me. And, the other thing too is just like, like I always try to stay grounded. I know we're using the lexicon of diversity, but I come from like a research standpoint of like race, class, and gender and disability. And so like the theory that directly comes from that is where like in the paper, I always start off by like putting my definition of what I think the definition of race is from like scholarly work. And so that's how I always try to ground myself in that. But everyone's different, but it's just like for me, because I want this to like speak to an experience like of like a historical experience of race, like I think it's really important to do that.
Yeah, that's all I would say, is that including those definitions, I think, is a good way for authors to clarify their own intent, clarify their own thinking, and also a way for authors to acknowledge alternative phrases that might be used for the same phenomena, and clarify to their audience, why they're choosing the phrase that they're choosing.
Yeah, I think that's solid advice, and I want to emphasize maybe for authors, and obviously Karin or Bree, if you guys have comments on this topic too, but anytime we bring in a new concept or theoretical framework into a paper, we reference its origin and we discuss why we're choosing it and how it satisfies or is good utility in this context. So, and I do agree that our authors should be in conversation with that changing lexicon, right? So if we're not writing into that conversation, then we're just watching it, kind of pass by without our input. So if our authors have things to say about it, they should be writing into the conversation. So
That especially also came up in our paper. Sorry, Canek.
Oh, no worries, you go.
Often, when talking about race, people will bring up the idea of color blindness or a colorblind ideology, but that language is ableist. So, for example, in our paper, we consciously chose to use the term color evasive ideology and linked to a paper on critical race study and disability studies. And I think too, interacting with changing lexicons, like it forces you to consider what you're really saying, when people supposedly adopt attitudes of color blindness, are they really being truly colorblind? No, they're being color evasive. And I think that's the better term to use.
Yeah, and so you asked about like this idea of race neutrality. So I kind of just like riffed on the word gender neutrality. Like I think Dorothy Smith like used a lot in her work, and she was a professor of nursing and did a lot of work about like the gendered quality of nursing. And so like she used gender neutral, so I just took that and made it race neutral. And like this idea that nothing can be race neutral because we live in a society that's ordered by white supremacy. So, and like trying to make something race neutral or being color evasive only serves the purpose of racial inequity, basically.
yeah, thank you guys. So I'm going to back out, just kind of zoom out. That really resonated for me in the moment, but I want to zoom out a little bit and just talk about your motivations for the study and your intentions. Like, you work in a funded grant that's about, equity and hiring practices. So I think it might be fair, Canek, to say that you were intentional about bringing race into your research and scholarly writing work. But I guess I'm curious, about like the decision to write a diversity paper, right? And if some authors may wonder, like, is this a diversity paper? Am I writing about diversity here? Or is it just sort of sidelined? Or like, what are some of the thoughts that you have when you're thinking about content and context and what you're going to be writing about, and whether it's really centering on diversity or sort of include some diverse elements? If that's fair enough. That's a question.
Yeah, I guess so. From like a really class-based perspective. So like if we think about engineering as something that's linked to industry, and industry being something that holds a lot of power, especially like engineering is really connected to defense. Like there's all this like pressure to do engineering and engineering education work that is meant to be profitable. And that kind of goes into diversity, where it's like, if you talk to like an engineering professor about diversity, oftentimes it's not going to be something that they're interested in. And when we do talk about diversity, it's often like from like a again, I'm sorry I have to say this, it's from like a petite bourgeoisie perspective. It's like where it's like you're from the perspective of someone where like money doesn't really matter, and like everyone's gonna find a job, and so like in terms of like where I come, right, like the decision to write about diversity for me is like about like my like experience of like insecurity. And a lot of people aren't going to want to write about it like that, and they don't have to. But like for me, like if you're going to write about diversity, like write about it in a way that's you know, like that speaks to something that's about like something serious about people's lives. And I think with that in mind, you know, you can write a pretty good, like you can at least be on track to write something that other people who like value this are going to find really interesting.
So the grant under which we wrote this paper, it's an AGEP grant. And so we have a whole lot of other programmatic components other than this research part. So Dr. Pearson has set up a system of affinity mentors for some graduate students at Rice University and Texas Southern University and the University of Houston. And I think part of rectifying inequities for graduate students hoping to join the professoriate is studying hiring in higher ed. And so that's really how we kind of fell into this paper and trying to see, you know, what explicit and implicit attitudes can we really find here? What are these recent graduates or soon to be graduates going up against? And like Canek said, I think really the underlying motivation for the paper was to create something that could be personally meaningful for a lot of people reading it. So, you know, hopefully if someone working in an HR department somewhere reads this paper, maybe reconsiders departmental language used in job announcements, or, you know, we're doing some trainings at Rice University with similar departments on our campus. And so just trying to prioritize utility, I think, was also important.
I think those are two great things, like knowing that this could be really powerful for someone reading it and really powerful for the utility of them reading it in the extension of their, you know, efficacy and their agency. And also it sounds like if you're doing work with your HR department, that's a constituent award nomination right there. So just think about it. Another question we want to get to here is about, you know, your paper really identified several ways in which faculty job postings could be written to target inclusivity. And I love that you had these rewrite sections where you said, you know, this could have been like this, guys, kind of really explicit. So I was thinking in parallel, you know, how do you think that various ASEE division calls for papers could be, you know, written to solicit more papers investigating or promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in engineering education and research? Any ideas? I mean, that's one of our missions, to get people to write, as the commission, to get people writing about this stuff. What are we saying wrong? You know, what can we be saying as divisions? And I'm coming from being the current paper chair of the pre-college engineering education division, and wishing that I had you know, elicited more diversity-oriented pre-college papers. So.
That is something that we've come up against, is sort of, and Dr. Pearson has spoken about it at length, on how almost any paper you write, if it involves racial and ethnic equity at all, it immediately becomes pigeonholed as a diversity paper, period. And so I think just, again, like thoughtful, purposeful inclusion of language that is clearly targeting issues pertinent to those minoritized groups in engineering education, like including that language in calls for papers from every division and not just the diversity divisions, I think would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Samara, and I guess like from kind of what I read something recently, and it was like, you know, we're in like this, like we're in this time right now of COVID where like unemployment is incredibly high, and but we can all see around us that like there's work that needs to be done, like in that, just like work, like there's things that people could be doing that would count as jobs if they could just be paid for them. And for me, that's kind of like how I write about diversity, is like, what if like things like that we see around us in engineering, like for instance, like Flint still doesn't have clean water, or when there was talking about building the border wall, you know, like I didn't see anything from engineering departments about like what that meant in terms of like quote unquote diversity. And so like for me, that's kind of where I try to come from with like, you know, how can we emphasize diversity is like, well, diversity is like part of everything in our world. And like, it's like I was saying about race neutral language, nothing can be race neutral. And so just kind of being able to see those implications and I guess like asking people to talk about those things more and frame them within an engineering education perspective. I think that's how I would do it.
Dr. Shirey, do you mind if I chime in for a second? Okay, so I know this session is specifically for authors, but I think from the reviewer end, something I ran into when I submitted an abstract for this upcoming conference was that I submitted to the multidisciplinary engineering division. And because I was talking about a Black woman and her experiences in a multidisciplinary engineering program, one of the reviewers suggested that my paper needed to be in Mind or in the Women in Engineering program. And so I found that very problematic because just because I'm writing about a Black woman does not mean her experience shouldn't be represented in that particular division. And so that's where I think, I guess, I'm not sure if it's the paper chair, communication issue to the reviewers, or I'm not exactly sure. ASEE's structure is a little confusing, so I'm not sure how the communication is distributed, but I know I found that very frustrating as someone who wants to break in that space. Like, I don't want to always submit to the diversity spaces. Like, I want to submit in a different division because that's what my work is about. But I want to tell the story of somebody in that particular space so you can improve the experiences there. And so that is frustrating, is that people, I don't know, they make it seem like diversity work has to be in this particular camp and it doesn't. And I think that's something that's been frustrating for me. So I just wanted to say that as somebody who wrote a paper or abstract and coming up against the reviewers.
No, I think that's a super good point. Sorry, Canek, please.
I was gonna say, yeah, that kind of connects back to what I mean in terms of like nothing's race neutral. Like you can, that's like in a very mundane way, like trigger like racial discrimination. And so like I think that's something to add. Like I think ASEE needs to seriously look into reviewer policy. I mean, I've run into it before myself, and we're trying to submit a paper to ERM, and they were very welcoming of our paper this time around. But I know we were kind of like worried. We're like, oh, this one, it's like we should contact the chair first. And it's like we would never have contacted the chair from Mind. So it's something that, yeah, like people encounter all the time. So that'd be something to do too.
I mean, in some ways, I wonder if it really, it seems like it hasn't become so normalized that that division would receive so many papers about diverse humans involved in them that they would be like, oh, it's just a paper, right? Like they have this construct in their head that's like, these papers don't have that. And when I see one exception, I think of it as exceptional and other, and I push it back. So, I mean, I agree that really has a lot to do with our expectations for what engineering education research is and what is appropriate for it. And I think the people here are in agreement that it's appropriate everywhere to have, situations that include diversity within engineering education everywhere. Yeah. So maybe that's this sort of like, to get back to this idea of calls for papers, or the role of the paper chair really in soliciting calls for papers and in recruiting and training reviewers. It's like, that's got to become normalized as an expectation of all those pieces. But structurally, we're coming from universities where there's maybe minorities and urban education division that's separate from the Department of Teaching and Learning and Policy and Leadership. That's potentially really different. And what does that mean for how our expectations are formed about what it looks like to do this education research? It's a good convo, and I am picturing this spilling off into a lot more convos for our commission's work, which I really appreciate. So thank you. I wanted to ask if, you know, Bree or Karen or any of our participants wanted to ask any other questions of our panelists. Otherwise, we have a couple more questions and then we're gonna tidy up and leave room if any members have any just questions about awards. I was gonna ask about, you know, you guys supporting each other. We've got Samara, who's an undergraduate, working with all of these doctors and professors, and you've used the word mentor several times, and I just love that you know, really feel a closeness with your professors, that you have mentors. And I know that there's a case where undergraduate students feel they are not able to access their professors. They feel they're, you know, even knocking on the door during office hours, and the virtual door now, I understand that it might be a little easier now to connect virtually than ever was in person. Some veils are dropped or something, but how did you guys support one another as you were learning about how to write an academic paper on this topic? And did it feel different in any other ways from how you've written other papers or done other work?
And Canek was also, I would say, an amazing mentor. And when you talk about learning how to write a paper on these topics in particular, I mean, that's his entire area of expertise. And so he and Dr. Pearson just shared so much information with me. My background is in the natural sciences. And so those sorts of papers, I think, are written really differently. And so I did work with Canek and Dr. Pearson, Dr. Phillips and Dr. Pearson. Sorry, Canek, it's difficult to shift calling you by your first name. On shifting out of the more, I guess, formulaic passive voice that can be in a lot of natural science publications into a more active voice.
So something we didn't mention when we were talking was that I was also a student of Rice, and Rice has this like residential system where they put you in colleges. And so Samara and I were actually like same in the same college, so we got to connect over a lot of the things that go on and kind of the inequities that result, and also like that we had like similar like backgrounds in terms of like before we came to Rice. And so just being able to kind of like I could trust her to understand what I was going to put down. And you know, like we're at this time where, you know, I'm still like technically a millennial, but none of my other millennial friends like who are younger than me will admit that, but I am. You know, like I had to do a lot of work to understand what makes this time different for our youth and students in college, and like being able to kind of level with Samara on that, and in terms of like, well, I'm on the other side of a PhD, and hiring is not easy, like for us, and now the pandemic, and like having that kind of in common, like being able to talk about stuff with another person who's part of a work group is very rare, I think. And so that's what really helped to me, at least.
It sounds like you guys implicitly had some of that, the sort of thoughtful, purposeful, like an understanding of your purposefulness in your words. You already had that kind of implicitly, but maybe I can refer back to Samara's former advice also, that, you know, you could just be explicit with somebody about what you mean if you wanted to, you know, bring them into that circle of trust, so to speak. But that's pretty cool. How did you actually write with all the various people? I mean, there's a lot of people on the grant, I'm guessing, and also on the paper. So like, did you feel process around that was difficult, or how'd that go?
Dr. Pearson is technically our team lead. So our project is formed out of the 3 Alliance institutions. So that's Rice, Texas Southern University, and University of Houston. And then Dr. Pearson oversees leadership at all 3 institutions. And so Dr. Phillips and I wrote the bulk of the paper with Dr. Pearson, and then the other PIs on our project all helped with editing and revising. And yeah, what would you say, Connie?
Yeah, I think basically being able to back up everything I wrote in that, because like a lot of the other authors aren't going to see things the same way I did. Like when you work in like a big group like this, like there's bound to be people who aren't going to agree with 100% of how you wrote something. I think, like, for instance, like, you know, I talk about police brutality and the paper, and like how talking about how like a place has police is like very ambiguous in terms of like how someone might take it, in terms of like whether or not if they benefit from police brutality or they not, or if they don't. And so like I knew that that kind of stuff might get some pushback, but I like the George Miller, I'm sorry, George Floyd happened, you know, as I was writing the paper, or like as we were doing the final draft of the paper, I think, or I think Brianna Taylor had already happened. And so I was just like, yeah, you know, like if we can't say these things now, like if you're writing in a, you know, like in a proposal or a job announcement, you know, you're talking about how great the surrounding area is, like how great who, you know, like geography is very racial. And so it's like, so yeah, I knew I could get pushback on that, but I knew like also like just, you know, I've studied this is, I can back it up. So
Yeah.
I think it's also worth noting that even though there were some instances of pushback on some of the topics that we were discussing in the paper, for what it's worth, submitting to Mind, I think we were given a lot more freedom to talk about those sorts of things.
yeah.
Dr. Pearson and I were working on a different paper that we submitted to the Faculty Development Division regarding how STEM proposals are reviewed, and similarly doing linguistic coding on panel reviews of different proposals from different institutions, and looking at potential disparities and how those proposals were evaluated. And we were trying to, as we do everywhere, just be honest, speak frankly, note what we see. And I noticed that in that other division, our ASEE reviewers gave us a lot more pushback than we got in Mind. They said things like, you consider the strain that NSF panelists are under when they're having to consider these proposals in such a short amount of time? Have you considered that you had more time than them to evaluate these proposals? Just little things like that. And I think, like Bree mentioned, that's just the insidious nature of normalized white supremacy in the United States, is that in some spaces you're allowed to talk about things and in other spaces you're not.
Or not just not allowed to talk about it, but actively silenced, right?
Right.
Great. Well, I really appreciate your time, and I hope that you guys will join me in a real call to our fellow ASW authors to take a good look at this paper, learn lessons from it and from this conversation. Note also that in the paper, discussion of, you know, an opt-out culture where people just don't talk about stuff is complicit in continuing the white supremacy that exists in the culture of academia in the United States. So, you know, the paper really calls great attention to that and can be a tool for talking to your colleagues about these issues. So I just really applaud you again. It's well worthy of its distinction now as the 2020 best CDEI paper. And we're really looking forward to seeing you present it again this summer. And we'll make sure that we have the schedule for that provided to other people that check out this webinar. And finally, you know, I just want to make sure that people have a way to get in touch. So I've just flipped over here to our email addresses for myself and for Karin. And I know that in the chat, we see Samara's, and also I know that we saw Canek's earlier. So I'll make sure that those are available. And of course, they can find you through ASW's hub as well, and through Rice University. So thank you, Bree, for putting this together for us to have the opportunity to hear from these two. It's really been nice for me. Thank you very much.
No problem. I'm happy to have y'all.
Great, great, great. And we welcome any comments about, you know, how the commission can work towards increasing engineering diversity, equity, and inclusion in engineering education and beyond. So please be in touch.
And do any of the other participants have any questions for our facilitators or guest speakers about the previous paper awardees or the new awards?
I have a question about the awards. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
So this is Carlotta Berry from Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology, and I am here representing Black in Engineering. And my question was about the constituent award. First of all, how big can the constituent group be? And do they all have to be members of ASAA?
That's a terrific question. Hi, Carlotta. Nice to see you.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. Karen, do you have an answer up at the top of your head?
I don't believe that there is a limit on the number of people that can be part of the constituent, and I don't believe that there's anything about all of them needing to be ASAA members.
Okay, thank you. That was my only question.
Yeah, the website does include some information about eligibility and
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing because I didn't say enough. Like Dr. Dr. Yvette Pearson, yeah, as the head PI of the project, she actually holds so many hats on this project, but she was the one, like, it was her idea to write this paper from the beginning. Like, she wanted to do job announcements, like, because representation is big for her. Representation in like the media that engineering departments have, and is something a big as assistant dean, something she works on really hard. And so she really likes connecting the idea of representation to all forms of media that engineering departments put out. And for me, like, I like to go just a little bit further than that, and I like to see how far we can go with stuff. So that's kind of how this paper kind of worked out.
I'm really excited that you've expanded it so much. I'm looking forward to hearing if these trends hold. I'm suspicious that they will, but
I've seen a lot more interesting things after reviewing more and more job announcements. Like, we've come across now several announcements where we have to figure out how to code information about campus police that are included in job announcements for higher ed positions. Things like that. It's been really, really interesting to look at it all en masse.
Great. Well, I do want to, sorry, Bree.
Is there a particular reason why you all chose the data science, and I forgot what the other bucket was, but those particular programs?
Well, our grant is for our AGAP grant is in the areas of data engineering and sciences. So these are, this was part of the paper that Dr. Phillips added. These are relatively new fields, and Canek, I liked your language a lot. He said we have a really unique opportunity here to kind of rectify some issues of underrepresentation kind of from the ground up. And that seems like a really special opportunity.
Yeah, with AGAP programs, you have to have, or with AGAP alliances, you have to have a target population. And so I guess when Yvette and Reggie were, and Wayne and Hanadi were making this up, they were like, oh, data engineering, data science is like a new field. And so that's like something that'll catch the NSF's eye. And so to align with the overall project, that's, that's why we chose data science and data engineering.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was just wondering, because I know this paper, y'all wrote this paper before everything started happening, like in 2020. But I noticed that this year, like CU Boulder, they had, I think, a pretty unique call for faculty in their new And it was broad across the College of Engineering. It wasn't just one particular discipline. But that call was pretty unique. That spoke to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I haven't seen it from anyone else. Granted, I don't see everything that's going out around in engineering education, but I thought that their call was pretty unique in comparison to anything else I've ever seen, especially even in our engineering education. Faculty opportunities are not, don't speak to diversity, equity, and inclusion like that. They want you to write a statement, but not show how it's integrated throughout your research, teaching, and service, or anything else that you do. So
yeah, we talk about that in terms of intentionality, or like that's what we want to talk about in the next paper, kind of like how like you have to have like proof of a PhD, but like when you like write your diversity statement, like they don't have that same level of certification. You just have to be able to convince somebody, and that often leads to like they're only really looking for you to have this research, and then they'll like whatever diversity expectations are not as important. The other thing, so UC Boulder has this really interesting thing going on right now. Like I think the reason for that call is they have this like office now set up to create more diverse outcomes with hiring searches. It's headed by Robin Sandekian, and she's part of the CDEI. Like I've seen her, like she reached out to me to like put a call out for a job, like a job in computer science or something. And so like you might see her name, and that might be one of the reasons why they are having that sort of like unique type of outreach, or not outreach, but hiring going on.
yeah, I know. I'm actually, so in 2019, I was a part of the second cohort for the active leadership intensive, kind of like a future faculty program. And so I met Robin through that. And so she had reached out to us to kind of see, what were we looking for in faculty, like in a faculty position. And so, so I know she had a lot to do with that shift. And so, but I'm excited about it. And I hope that other universities follow with trying to improve their calls for faculty. But I mean, we can end if y'all like. I don't think I have any more questions.
I mean, I promised these guys just an hour, so I just want to thank you guys again for giving us an hour during your winter breaks and everything. It's really special to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you. This was great.
Yeah, y'all did a great job. Thank you so much.